Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
The idea that a teacher or a parent would make a child feel that they were smart or dumb just staggers me.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
G'day, this is Justin Coulson and Kylie Coulson. We're the parents of 6 children, 6 daughters, and I'm the author of 6 books about raising happy families, and we exist really to help you to make your family happier. Welcome to the podcast. We got a 5-star review, Kylie, and I'm going to read it to you. Is that okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, this is from Tilsy Wilsey in the United States of America. We got listeners all over we showed up on like Hong Kong and a bunch of European charts in terms of how the podcast is literally going all over the world. It's amazing.
That's so exciting.
But Tilsy Wilsey said...
I love that name.
And I love the names. Hello, 5-star review. Kylie and Justin, you're a wonderful team. Even though my boys are grown men now, I love your insights. I want to continue my relationship with them and look forward to how I can be a wonderful grandmother one day. Not just yet, but one day.
I love that.
Yeah, thanks, Tilsy Wilsey. It's funny how many people I have say that they listen to the podcast and they don't have kids at all, or they're grandparents. And what we love about it is it's really just a conversation about relationships and how to make relationships happier.
So book club is tomorrow night.
Yeah, week 3.
Week 3. And we're going to be discussing, every week I say the same thing. We're going to be discussing some really, really cool stuff.
I just need to, for people who are new to the podcast and don't know what we're talking about with Book Club, here's the way it works. Book Club is part of the Happy Families membership. So at Happy Families, we know that a lot of people want ongoing support for their families. We've got the podcast, it's free. We've got a Facebook page, we've got a website. But to get into the really nitty-gritty stuff, we have this membership where people can sign up. They get a monthly webinar with me. We have, if you're a premium member, you get Q&As with me at least monthly, sometimes more than that. There's a whole lot of other things that we do as well. But one of the central things is book club, and you look after that. So we're going through one of my 6 books right now.
Well, I think that we actually created book club so I'd read your books. Is that why we did this?
You know, before we even started doing book club, so I've written 6 books and Kylie had only read one of them and used the excuse that, I'm really busy because I'm a mum.
I think that's a very legitimate answer. Thank you very much.
My husband's written 6 books, but I'm not interested. I know what I'm doing. I've got this covered. Anyway,
I live it.
Yeah. So you read 21 Days to a Happier Family for book club.
No. I had read that one. It took me 2 years to do it, but I had read it. I did have to reread it in time for book club, but 9 Ways is new.
So 9 Ways to a Resilient Child is what we're doing for book club this month as part of the Happy Families membership.
And obviously, being 9 Ways to a Resilient Child, we're talking about all these things that we can do to help make our children more resilient. And tomorrow night's discussion, we are going to be talking about there's no such thing as smart. Yeah. This really struck a chord with me because I remember when we moved over from New Zealand to Australia, I was in grade 5 and I took a test with the rest of the class and I didn't do very well. The crossover from what I had learned in New Zealand to what was being taught in Australia was pretty significant. And I really, I passed, but only just. They sat us in order of how we ranked in the test. And if you were number 1, you got to sit right next to the teacher and you weaved your way through until you hit number 25. I was 24. And that experience has literally stayed with me my entire adult life. And I always think about the fact that I'm not very good at maths. That's something that I've always believed as a result of that experience.
It's stunning to me that this could happen in a classroom. I know it happened many years ago because we're not spring chickens anymore, but I still hear stories like that today. It doesn't happen very often. These are very much horror stories in the 2020s. But the idea that a teacher or a parent would make a child feel that they were smart or dumb just staggers me. You know why I actually called this chapter There's No Such Thing as Smart or Dumb? We had our eldest daughter. She was sitting in the back seat of the car talking to one of her friends. I was driving them somewhere and they were talking about their future, their potential futures, the kinds of lives that they wanted to live. One of her friends actually said, I could never do that. I'm not smart enough. And I've hit the brakes and pulled the car over and turned around and sat in the back seat. And I've gone, there's no such thing as smart or dumb. There's people who work at stuff and people who don't.
Now, no wonder our kids' friends are scared to get in the car with you.
Well, she looked really scared. Now, I need to clarify something really clearly. There are some things that some people will not be able to do. Not everybody can become a rocket scientist. Not everybody can become a Liberace or an Elton John or a concert pianist or whatever. But I don't think that it's our job as parents or teachers to look at a child and tell them that they can't do it. What I think we want to do is give them all the support in the world so that they can move in the direction of what fulfills them and let them decide for themselves if they can or they can't. But the whole idea here is there's no such thing as smart or dumb. And to me, that's a resilience promoting mindset, because if you believe that there's no such thing as smart or dumb, there's just people who work at stuff and people who don't, you're probably going to work pretty tenaciously.
What stood out to me in the book is you talk about how we're actually born with this resilience. You know, when you think of a little baby, once they start moving, they are just so intent on learning that next skill, whether it be, sitting up or starting to walk. And you'll watch them. They literally will fall down 100 times in a day, but they get themselves back up again and they keep at it. I love watching them, explore their world, and they don't see a fall down as a mistake or a failure. It's actually just another opportunity to get right back up again. And you watch them do that. They're so energized by this new found skill. What is it about life that just kind of completely shatters that by the time they hit school age?
I wish I'd heard what I'm about to say before I wrote the book, but I was at a conference a couple of years ago and heard somebody say, to learn a musical instrument, a person has to make a lot of mistakes, maybe even 1 million. To learn how to speak a foreign language, a person has to make a lot of mistakes, maybe even 1 million. Like, you don't see a child fall down for the 57th time while they're trying to learn to walk and look up and say, actually, Mum, Dad, it's too hard. I give up. I'm just going to crawl for the rest of my life. You don't say that for two reasons. First of all, because children who are learning to walk don't have the verbal capacity to say a sentence that complex, but they just keep on trying. We are wired to learn and master our environment and grow. We're wired to be resilient and push through these hard things. But you're right, society and sometimes parents and sometimes teachers and sometimes other people around our children, we teach them that we can't, and we do it by example. Like, for example, cross country is coming up for a lot of school kids, certainly around Queensland and in other parts of the country as well. Cross country is, the major athletic event. Well, it's a big running event that happens in most schools. And what's actually happening increasingly is I hear parents say, oh, no, we're not really an athletic family. You don't need to go. Or, no, we're not runners. I don't even run to the letterbox, let alone run 3 kilometers. And there's this mindset that we don't have to try. And I'm not a singer. I'm not good at maths. I'm not good at that. That's not in our genes. Or the opposite. We've got this particular heritage and therefore we're angry, or we're very good with our money, or we're this, or we're that. We actually pass these mindsets along, and they're so limiting and they're so unhealthy. And we call this a fixed mindset. So that's the first topic in book club for tomorrow night. We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, let's talk briefly about our second big topic that we're going to cover in book club.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Are screens creating tension at home? Tweens, Teens and Screens is a webinar to guide families to healthy, safe super screen solutions. Buy it today at happyfamilies.com.au/shop.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now. And we are talking about book club. We have book club tomorrow night and we're up to week 3. We've got 1 more week left, and we've been talking about some really exciting things and simple ways that we can help instill resilience in our children.
Okay, so we've talked about having a growth mindset, or at least we've skimmed the surface of that in our last brief conversation. What's the second thing that you're going to be talking about in depth tomorrow night?
It's all about relationships.
Yeah.
I thought you don't actually share this story in the book, but as I was reading through it, a story that you've told multiple times in our home with our children as we've been discussing different things, and it's about a young African-American student who steals a book from the library.
I love this story. Olly Neal is his name.
Can you tell the story? Because you tell it so much better than I do.
Sure thing. So Olly Neal, growing up in the 1950s in the southern states of America, segregated South. So you've got all these black kids who are going to this impoverished school with no resources. And Olly Neal, I think from memory, was around about 14 years old at the time. He was one of a very, very, very large family. It was either 11 or 13 kids or something like that. His dad had next to no education, a grade 2 education, and he was a peasant farmer just trying to scrape by and keep his family fed. And Olly hated school. So one day he wags class, but he knows that if he gets caught outside of school, the truancy officer is going to give him a beating and then take him home to his dad, who's probably going to give him a beating as well. And so he decides that instead of taking off from school, he's going to go into the library. Because that's where kids go, right? That's where you're safe. That's where you can't get in trouble. No one ever gets into trouble in the library. While he's in there, he's looking at the bookshelf and he sees a book on the shelf that kind of captures his interest just a little bit. The book is called The Treasure of Pleasant Valley. And I mean, what 14-year-old is not going to be interested in a book with a title like that, especially when like for the 1950s, the cover had a fairly racy illustration of a woman on, looking a little bit saucy, I suppose you might say. So the book was by an African-American novelist called Frank Yerby. And Olly Neal walks over to the shelf and picks it up and thinks, I wonder what the Treasure of Pleasant Valley is. And when no one's looking, he stuffs the book underneath his shirt. I mean, books are free to borrow from the library, but for some reason, because he's a delinquent teenage boy who's got attitude, he decides that he's going to steal it. He walks out of the library, takes it home, reads it. And when he talks about this experience, he says, I fell in love with reading. I'd never really enjoyed reading. I only read because I had to, but I fell in love with reading as I read this book. The next week, he walked back into the library. When no one's watching, he sort of sneaks the book back onto the shelf and sees another novel by Frank Yerby. So he's like, oh, well, I liked the first one. I'll steal that one too. Puts it under his jacket, walks out of the library, comes back about a week later. There's another Yerby novel there. So he does the swap, steals that one, does it until he's read 4 of these Yerby novels. Now, on looking back at this, what Olly Neal says is this became a transformative time in my life because I fell in love with reading and began to devour everything. In fact, what ended up happening for Olly Neal is that he became a top-level student. He fell in love with learning. He read his textbooks. He read the newspapers. He read everything. It was almost like the Frank Yerby novels had changed his view of the world because he fell in love with what books can teach us and what words can teach us. Anyway, he ended up graduating with first-class honours from high school and got into law school in the late 50s, early 60s. Very unusual, obviously, for an African-American kid to be going to law school, especially in the southern states. Became a civil rights lawyer at the time of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. This is when it was all happening. The Selma stuff, the bus boycotts, all of the things that we watch here in Australia and see from a distance. He was in the thick of it. Now, Olly Neal ended up going on to become not just a lawyer, but a judge. And eventually he was appointed as like the chief judge in the state. He became the first African-American in the 1980s to be the Supreme Court justice, basically, in that state. It was a really big deal, really high honor. And Olly Neal would keep on going back to his school, the place that he'd gone and stolen those books from, so that he could talk to the students and say, hey, I was where you are now and look at the life you can create. Just work hard and study. And it kind of tried to give them that growth mindset that we talked about earlier in the podcast. Anyway, at one of the school reunions that he attended, he bumped into Mrs. Grady, the school librarian. And while he's talking to Mrs. Grady,
This is my favourite part.
He says to her, I need to tell you how impactful your school library was in the life that I now live. And he tells about how he stole the Frank Yerby novels and, 1 week at a time, brought them back, put them on the shelf and said, Mrs. Grady, I just wanted to say sorry for stealing the books, but since you didn't really know, I just want you to know what a difference your library made in my life. Well, Mrs. Grady says, Olly Neal, I have a little story to tell you. And she says, I saw you steal that first book. But instead of yelling at you, which is what I wanted to do, instead of telling you, how dare you, what do you think you're doing, you borrowed that book properly, young man. She said something inside me made me stop. And I was afraid that if I yelled at you, that you might never actually borrow a book from my library ever. And I just wanted you to love reading, so I let you go. And she said every librarian instinct in me was saying, stop right now. But I just had to let you go. She said that weekend, it was wrestling on my conscience so much that I got into my car and I drove the 70 miles to I think it was Memphis that she drove to. 70 miles. That's like 120 kilometres, 110, 120 Ks. And I'd imagine that the cars weren't as comfortable in the 1950s and the roads probably weren't as good either. So she did the drive, went to 3 different bookstores until she found a novel by Frank Yerby, which she bought and put on the bookshelf. And then she watched and waited, and a week later, she said, Olly Neal, I watched you come back into the library. I watched you put that first novel down and pick that second one up and steal that too. And she sort of said, I've never been so excited to see a student steal a book as I was when you stole that second novel. So the next weekend she got in the car and drove to another city and went to another couple of bookstores and bought another Frank Yerby novel. And the following weekend she did it again. And then she said, Olly, I had to stop after I'd done it 3 times because I'd run out of money for petrol and I'd run out of money for books. The school wasn't paying for it. I was coming out of my resources. I just did it because I knew that something had sparked inside you. And in that moment, there's this wonderful awareness that Olly Neal has, that this is a teacher who has made it all about the relationship and all about the student. And because she'd done that, it had changed his life for the better.
So tomorrow night in book club, we're going to talk about the importance of, that one relationship. Our children don't need to have a bajillion people around them who can support them, but if they can just have one significant person in their lives who takes them under their wings and loves them and supports them in ways that helps them to feel seen, valued and heard, then they can flourish and they can have a sense of resilience in their lives.
Well, book club, it's tomorrow night for our Happy Families members. If you're not a member, please visit happyfamilies.com.au and get on it. It's where you want to be. I think that you're going to get so much from it. Memberships from as little as $12 a month, $17 for a premium membership. We would love to have you there. We really hope that you've enjoyed the podcast. Thank you so much for participating and listening. And just like Tilsy Wilsey, if you do enjoy it, leave us those 5-star reviews and ratings at Apple Podcasts. It helps other people to find out about the podcast and make their family happier. We really appreciate the work of Justin Rulon from Bridge Media and our executive producer, Craig Bruce. If you'd like more information about making your family happier, like joining book club and becoming part of the family, you can get all the information at happyfamilies.com.au.